American Indians learned how to cultivate tomatoes, corn, and beans centuries ago. Those Indians taught the first colonists how to farm on this land, how to grow and harvest these foods, and many others. There are still Indians in America who farm and live as their relatives did in the 1600s. They are the Hopi of northern Arizona. They live in a land that seems to us harsh, desolate, and useless. And it is, in fact, a desert. But by using sound, conservative farming techniques, they produce more food than they need to survive. They have lived right here for 1,000 years, with a flourishing culture that even today is vibrant and vital. It involves hand cultivation and a complete reliance on rainfall for irrigation. It requires a lot of physical work, but in normal years, a farmer can feed a family and have food left over to store for leaner times. This kind of farming is very similar to the farming which the first colonists used in New England. European colonists planted their crops with only the most basic tools. It was hard work. Families worked together, and neighbors helped neighbors. It took time for these people to learn farming in North America, but the vastness and richness of the land soon assured a good life for most. They developed a tradition of free and independent family farms, growing all that the family required while sending surpluses back to England. The American landscape was wide open, essentially free for the taking by anyone with the courage and the energy to do just that. Almost everyone farmed. Of the 2.5 million people who called themselves Americans then, 99% lived on farms. Few people lived in the small cities. Commerce was based on trade more than cash, and that's the way it worked until long after independence from Britain in 1776. The revolutionary soldiers were fighting for a different kind of independence. A whole new way of thinking about citizens and government was being drafted. It was unlike anything people had done before. The American Revolution was a physical war, but it was also a mental war. It was an exciting time of fresh and competing ideas, and everyone argued about how people should live and work together. Our third president, Thomas Jefferson, was one of the most convincing voices in the arguments. He knew that farming was a part of this fight. He expressed the idea that Americans could be free and independent of England if we maintained a tradition of the family farm, capable of growing everything it required for food and clothing, depending on no other person or government or foreign country for survival. So our Declaration of Independence was all tied up with the possibilities inherent in an independent family farm. The people who came in large clipper ships to America had suffered famine and oppression in their homelands of Ireland, Italy, and England. When they got here, they took the land from the Indians, who then suffered famine and oppression themselves. The new Americans cleared the land and planted it, and sent down roots of their own. From 1776 to the middle of the 1800s, the population was growing tremendously. People were moving from the East Coast into Ohio, Illinois, Kansas, and Missouri, Georgia, Tennessee, all through the country west of the mountains where land was cheap and fertile. Families were clearing more and more land, planting, harvesting, sometimes prospering, sometimes not. The people who took the risk and moved here had energy and imagination. They needed plenty of each. There are limits to the amount of land a family can work, limits to what simple tools can cultivate. Even with a horse and plow, a farmer could only cultivate 2 acres in a day. But the land and the farmers were productive enough to feed the families and still send some surplus to town to sell or trade. The towns grew based on the commerce of agriculture. The people who lived in the towns and cities then worked in jobs that often supported the farm and the farmer. Shipping, storing, buying and selling crops, commodities, and equipment became big business. and cities grew from the little towns, based on thriving agriculture. As the cities grew, their demand for food grew. This created a cycle of supply and demand, and farmers started thinking more about selling crops for cash rather than growing them for subsistence. It was an exciting time for some. Fortunes were made in storing, shipping, and financing commodities. Some urban merchants and brokers began to make more money on agricultural products than the farmers who produced them. The farmers knew that to increase their profits, they would need to increase their yield. Slave labor was one way of doing just that. The use of slave labor was common in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Even Washington and Jefferson, who thought and wrote so much about mankind and humanity and freedom from oppression, owned slaves. For decades before the Civil War, two new revolutions developed. One was about ethics, the debate over the morality of slavery, a form of oppression on which the new prosperity of the nation was partly based. The other was about engineering and practical science, and would later be called the Industrial Revolution. For hundreds of years, this was the way every tool was made, by hand, one part at a time. Then machines were built that could make parts which were identical. This made mass production possible. Mass production made mechanization possible. Mechanization revolutionized production, transportation, and processing. It changed everything and everybody in agriculture. It meant a worker could be much more productive. And that meant fewer farm workers were needed to grow food for the nation. The debate over slavery erupted in the form of the Civil War. During the war, most of the labor force was off shooting at each other, but agricultural expansion barely slowed. The new machines made it possible for those that stayed behind on the farm to continue the production of commodities the nation needed. There were problems for many when peace came. Farms and plantations had been destroyed, and thousands who had worked them, black and white, no longer had homes. So many people after the war moved farther west, looking for new beginnings. During the Civil War, demand and prices for food had been high. After the war, prices dropped, and the farm economy went through a long depression. Farmers reacted by organizing into unions and cooperatives, pooling their efforts and power in business and politics. Agriculture was changing rapidly. America was changing with it. The government began a program of providing land grants for agricultural colleges. The science and art of farming constantly developed. The old self-sufficient family farm, aloof and independent, was being seen as less productive. From around 1900 until after World War I, farmers began to prosper again, but with crops which could be grown in huge volumes and shipped to distant markets. The land had always seemed limitless, an exploitable resource to be used and then discarded. In the Midwest, they planted crop after crop, eager for every possible dollar. The result was soil depleted of nutrients. The result was erosion. The result was disaster. When the farmer's luck absolutely ran out, a terrible drought came. The eroded soil turned to dust. The wind came. It lifted the dust into clouds that darkened the noonday sun and the futures of millions. Then the stock market collapsed in 1929, and the agricultural economy collapsed with it. Everyone had been trying to get rich quick. Now, many were impoverished instead. It was a desperate, empty time. People were scared. The farmers appealed to the government for help. The government tried many radical measures: price supports, subsidies, public works programs. In an effort to reduce supply and stabilize prices, the government paid farmers to leave their land idle. These programs helped many large farming operations stay in business, but often family farms were sold for a few $100s or simply abandoned. They usually became part of a larger, consolidated, business-oriented farm. Farmers either stayed on as hired laborers or moved away. Families took to the road again, moving west. Men, women, and children who had been proud and self-sufficient farmers were now picking peas for 25 cents a day when they could get the work. But the larger farms were successful in providing the nation with food it could afford. America was a very different place than Jefferson imagined, but it was still a vital, innovative climate for doing things. In 1939, World War II began in Europe. America thought it could safely isolate itself from the conflict. With our farm-based economy, we were an independent nation. To America, the beginning of World War II meant limitless manufacturing jobs in the cities and prosperity after 10 years of depression.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
but the surprise attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor electrified the nation into war. The labor force was gone again, and the few farmers who remained on the land were challenged again to adapt and improve their methods. They succeeded by continuing to innovate and experiment. Research and development of agricultural techniques went into high gear. World War II provoked all sorts of scientific developments, many related to agriculture. Researchers came up with all sorts of new fertilizers, planting techniques, and pesticides, like DDT. This research increased farm yield almost 50% over yields of a few years earlier. When the war ended, the need for the small family farms seemed about gone. Big corporations now owned much of America's farmland. Some also owned the chemical and equipment companies necessary for the large farms. These large agribusiness operations made farming even more productive, and that made food cheaper. And changes continued. Research work continued after the war, but frightening discoveries were made. The pesticides and chemicals that seemed perfect solutions to age-old problems were discovered to have created new and scary problems of their own. DDT, which seemed so wonderful in the 1940s, was discovered in the 50s and 60s to have caused severe damage to the environment. Agriculture was America's first industry. It is still our most important. It has changed and evolved. We've learned and adapted. We still have learning and adapting to do. We can still learn things from the Hopi about living in harmony with the land, growing what we need, about caring for the soil, understanding it. We can't go back to what used to be. We can't be Hopis or farm like colonials, but we can learn from them and from the past. We are going to have to find our own way of feeding this large nation we call America.